Thank you. Thank you very much. It is really remarkable that as I come to the end of my long career, 450 years as a historian, I return to the kind of things that I did at the very beginning. That is to say, I go back to, thanks to COVID or damn COVID, return to the kind of small article based upon an urban environment, very close to the evidence, very close to documentation. And it is, first of all, let me say that I am delighted and honored to be here with the future and present of Iberian studies, while I am the past, perhaps. So it is wonderful to be here with all of you. I will also say to you that this is one of the children of COVID. By the kind of serendipity that happens, I walk into the library in late February of 2020, and I am walking through these shelves as I like to do, rather than go on a virtual search for things. I walk around in the library and you find things that you didn't think was there. And then I see like 100 volumes of documents from Ávila. Wow. I took as many as I could. The library closed three days afterwards. And I spent the next 2 years writing articles from that sources. So in a longer version of this paper, I examined the Catholic Monarchs' relentless fiscal policies towards the city of Ávila. There was nothing new about their demands except the frequency. Isabella and Ferdinand exploited to the maximum long-established justification for taxation and conscription. This included the revival of the Santa Hermandad, repeated appeals for money and men to meet the challenges of the Civil War, the wars against Portugal in the 1470s, against Granada in the 1480s, the Italian campaigns after 1494, and the restoration of order. The defense of the realm, something that Estrella used to say all the time, was as compelling in the late 15th century as it had been in an earlier age. In that section of the paper, the one that you are not hearing, I argue that the fiscal demands on Ávila's Jews and Muslims and their unavoidable acquiescence to royal requests serve as a model for the exponential increase in demands for taxes, subsidies, men, foodstuff, and equipment from Ávila in the late 15th century. Violence defined the relationship between the crown, the city, and its Christian, Jewish, and Muslim inhabitants. And examples could be found abundantly in Ávila's extant documentation. Urban factions fought in the city streets. Peasants were often victims of the Lord's greed. One man knifed another in the face as a response to offensive words. A man already committed to service in the Granada War and soon to depart the city, fled at his inability to separate from his adulterous wife. A Muslim slave, a young girl with a face tattoo to indicate her honor and status, was stolen with little recourse to the law. Jews and Muslims received the brunt of these abuses. Violence against them in the city and its hinterland often forced the crown to intervene to little relief. Attacks against the Jews were frequent, rising to a perilous level in 1491, when the backlash to the infamous trial of the Niño de la Guardia swept the city. Some Ávila Jews and conversos were executed after being found guilty of a fabricated blood libel. Ávila's Jews had to be protected by a direct order of the crown from the mob violence that existed in the city. Muslim bricklayers' warehouses on Luenga Street were robbed and vandalized. Jews and Muslims were segregated into specific neighborhoods in 1478 and afterwards, ending centuries of easy commingling in the city streets. These violent episodes were replicated throughout the peninsula in the waning years of the 15th century and early 16th century, as it was the case in Granada after the first Alpujarra rebellion in 1499. Missing from these archival accounts are also the daily humiliations, pejorative terms, and gestures that sought to establish relationships of inequality between Christians and others. And nothing asserted that uneven relationship more than fiscal obligations. This was so even though the larger number of conversos after the 1440s and the close relationship with the former co-religionists, often close family ties, problematized the evidence. One positive is that there is no evidence of conflict between Muslims and Jews, though tensions and rivalry were frequent in the Jewish Aljama. Ávila Jews and Muslims represented a regular and substantial source of income for the crown. They already did so in the late 13th century, when the city ranked third in the head test of Jews after Toledo and Burgos. In 1391, the Jewish communities in those two largest cities have been erased. And by the late 15th century, Ávila Jews paid the largest head tax in Castile. Muslims present in large numbers in Ávila and active in agriculture and construction work also pay substantial amounts, though less than that of the Jewish community. After 1474, beyond the annual head tax, the fiscal demands on religious minorities rose to an unprecedented level. The exigencies of war forced the Catholic monarchs to seek new resources of income from everybody. War thus became the most notable excuse for fiscal demands. In the case of Jews and Muslims, this was a doubly painful tribute. Muslims were asked to contribute to a campaign against their own co-religionists. Jews were also forced to contribute to campaigns which in hindsight, the outcome was the edict of expulsion. It was a no-win situation. After the Catholic monarchs revived the medieval Santa Hermandad, everyone excepting nobles and those on the frontier with Granada became liable for contributions. Representatives of the Jewish and Muslim aljamas, often one spokesman negotiated for both, was continuously engaged in discussions as to how much to pay. This was an annual contribution of around 77,000 maravedíes just for the city, and not including the many villages in Ávila's intensive hinterland. And the Crown exercised extreme vigilance in funding a military enterprise, the Santa Hermandad, that had proved so vital in the campaigns against Portugal, in pacifying an Honduran nobility, and by 1480, an important military presence in the Granada frontier. Ávila's municipal council sought, often unsuccessfully, because of royal intervention, to shift most of the fiscal burden on its religious minorities. In one instance, the city council sought to collect the Hermandad's assessments twice, hoping, one may be led to believe, to void its own contributions. The Crown, after Jews and Muslims' loud complaints, ordered Ávila to cease and desist. To add insult to injury, most of the collectors of the Hermandades' dues were either Jews or conversos, most notably Abraham Señor, who held among his many duties for the Castilian crown and extensive tax farming activities, the position of head financial administrator for the Santa Hermandad. To add even further insult, the Jewish communities bitterly complained that they were unable to pay because of the agravios y prejuicios, damages and prejudice they suffered at the hands of the corregidor. In essence, the Jewish community was asked, and not just exceptionally, to pay twice. To complicate matters further, Jews and Muslims have been asked to segregate into distinct neighborhoods in the city, the Juderia and the Moreria, in 1478. In an ironic twist to this, the city council asked the bishop to delay, to provide additional time, especially to favor wealthy Jews who could not get houses good enough for them to live and move into the Juderias and Morerias. While the head tax and annual contributions to support the Santa Hermandad were onerous, they represented only a portion of the long-established taxes that the Crown sought to collect, not always successfully, from all subjects, including Jews and Muslims. Moneda forera brought additional income to the Castilian rulers in exchange for promises not to devalue the coinage. In the period between 1474 and 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand sought to tap every fiscal source for revenue. Sometimes they too often complained at the disregard of the long-held exemptions or dragged their feet. The Crown pushed back, always deploying the arguments of war as a necessity for the defense of the realm and of the Catholic faith. These multivalent political and ideological discourses follow a pattern dating to an earlier age, emphasizing a Castilian and a Christian identity. In 1476, as the Catholic monarchs asked for extraordinary contributions, a repartimiento from the city of Ávila and the aljamas, the royal petition bemoaned the invasion of Castile by the Portuguese, who, in seeing greed and presumption of the Castilian rebels, quote, attracted to Castile many people of diverse status, all men of ill desires and corrupted lives. This is what we all know about the invaders. They're all corrupted. When in the 1480s, with order restored, Isabella and Ferdinand turned to the campaign against Granada, they emphasized again and again the relationship between fiscal demands and the struggle against the infidels. There was no end to the way medieval and early modern rulers, or in this case, Ferdinand and Isabella, found ways of raising money. When need pressed, the Catholic Monarchs appealed to the courts for extraordinary subsidies from municipalities, the church, and the religious minorities. And if some of these attempts failed, there was always the impositos, or forced loan that amounted more to blackmail than to real loans. While Jews and Muslims were not liable for military service, they were important contributors to the war efforts, either as part of the Hermandades' annual assessment, subsidies, head tax, and the like. Religious minorities carry most of the burden of taxes, but they also were liable for contributions in kind or for the monetary equivalent required to support the war effort. Wheat and barley was needed to feed the foot soldiers and cavalry deployed to the Granada frontier. Animals and tools were also required for the military campaigns. In May 1486, the breakdown of the 1,000 fanegas de pan, fanegas of bread, of wheat and barley, to be collected from the town of Ladrada and assigned to the Duchess of Albuquerque, included at least 24 Jews as contributors, most of them either vecinos of Ladrada or of the nearby village of Casarrubios. The list of contributors most probably included 3 conversos, Diego Notario, a notary, and Pedro Toledano, and they were listed as sharing the payments of their alleged contributions, or allotted contributions in fanegas de pan with Jews. Bellocino, a Jew of Ladrada, joined Pedro Toledano. Abraham made his contribution in partnership with Diego Notario, who also had 6 additional payments of grain on his own, reflecting his widespread ownership of land leases in Ladrada. Finally, Alonso de Quesorna teamed with another Abraham, this one from Casarrubios, to contribute 8 fanegas de pan. Altogether, the Jews and conversos we can identify contributed at least 312 fanegas of the total 1,000, while the Christians, a much larger number of them, 88 altogether, contributed the rest. Diego Notario was the largest contributor in the entire list with 46 fanegas in 6 different individual allotments, plus probably half of the 14 fanegas contributed together with Pelloncino or Bellocid. 3 or 4 years before 1486, the Catholic monarchs had already established their indisputed rule over an always unruling nobility and reluctant municipalities in Castile. The war against Granada moved to its inexorable conclusion, though hard fighting was still to be done. The Inquisition, though not formally established until the following year, had already begun its nefarious activities. In Ávila, Jews and Muslims had been segregated to pre-designed parts of town. The fiscal burdens and violence increased. In this context, the actions around 1482-1483 are revealing of the special burden religious minorities had to suffer because of their beliefs. On 4 successive documents between the end of 1482 and the early months of 1483, we can follow the way crown, city, and religious minorities interacted on fiscal matters, usually to the detriment of the latter. On 10 January 1483, Isabella and Ferdinand notified Ávila and the villages under this jurisdiction of their, quote, need to provision the city of Alhama de Almería, 6 leagues from Granada. Pointing to the need to feed the garrisons and for the military campaign, the king and queen requested the extraordinary amount of 30,000 beasts of burden to transport the victuals to the south, 6,000 peones, footmen in charge of the mules and donkeys, 1,000 shovels, 1,000 hoes, and 500 iron and steel 2-pronged axes from the Castilian realm. Since Ávila and its hinterland were sparsely populated, this assessment was a hard blow to the financial integrity of the region. Different from other calls for contribution, this demand, clearly intended for the campaign against Granada and for the defense of a strategic outpost on the frontier, included all, quote, the privileged who lived in the city, churches, and monasteries, and the aljamas of Jews and Muslims. In apportioning the contribution, the sum was to be assessed 30 peones and 79 beasts, with hoes and shovels and axes. And below, I'll try to explain this, and it's very confusing. The municipal council, of course, shifted most of the obligation to the religious minorities. By 1st February 1483, the members of the municipal council decided that Ávila's contribution would be allotted in the following manner. Christians were to contribute 10 peones of the 30 assessed to the city. 6 and 2/3 peones were to lead the beasts, while 3 and 1/3 peones carried the shovels, hoes, and axes. As to this, the council set the contributions of the assigned tools as 1 hoe and a half per every 5, 1 shovel and a half for every 5, and half an axe for every 2. At a meeting with the Alhama's representatives, the council determined that the rest of the assessment was to be covered by the Jews and Muslims. That is, 2/3 of the remaining was to be paid by religious minorities and only 1/3 by the Christian population. Fiscal violence indeed. And the Alhama representatives acquiesced without resistance. In the convoluted divisions of the peones, beasts, and lords, and tools to be sent to the kings of the Granada frontier, the Alhamas were liable for 20 peones out of 30, 52 and 1/3 of the beasts. I don't know how you're going to divide a donkey into 3. And 1 axe and 2/3 for every 2 axes. As if this was not enough, the Alhamas had to add 105 fanegas and 4 selemines of barley. And I can tell you what this means in terms of the Americans' weight. Within days, both Alhamas undertook internal assessment. 5 minutes. Okay. Within this, where was I? Within both days, both Alhamas undertook internal assessments to meet royal and municipal demands. These 2 documents, one from the Jewish Alhama on 8 February 1483, and the other from the Muslim Alhama 2 days later, are among the most important sources for the history of Avila's religious minorities. Both provided a census of those contributing and those of most of the Jews and Muslims head of household, for a close approximation to the numbers of Jews and Muslims living in the city. Besides naming everyone's contributing and sometimes the trade, and these are heads of household, the documents provide important clues as to the social and economic conditions and information for preliminary prosopographies. Elsewhere, I have calculated, following a seminar article published by Sebastián de Tapia almost 3 decades ago, the number of Jews head of households between 264 and 285. That is to say, around more than 1,000 Jews in Ávila at the end of the 15th century. Muslims, numerically inferior to Jews in Ávila proper, were present in large number in the countryside, number 183 heads of households. One is on solid ground when one may argue that religious minorities comprise a lot more than 1/5 of the population of the city, which would have been around 5,000 inhabitants altogether at that time. As the Tapia has shown, while, quote, Christian taxpayers or picheros, not everybody was liable for taxes, either because of poverty or privilege, represented 75% of all those contributing. They pay only 33% of the assessed tax. Jews, representing 17% of the taxpayers, contributed 44.3%, while Muslims, only 8% of the taxable population, contributed 22.2% to the entire sum to be collected from Ávila by the Catholic Monarchs. The Tapia's calculations raise some significant questions. Jews and Muslims, while only 25% of the active tax-paying population, if we accept the lowest possible figure, contributed 66.5% of the total tax assessment. This was indeed fiscal violence perpetrated by the municipal authorities with the acquiescence of the crown and with the consent, how could they survive otherwise, of Jews and Muslims in late 15th century Ávila. Since we're running out of time, the pages that I have a breakdown of the people who are listed. And of course, you see the great social differences within the Jewish community and within the Muslim community. But there are the families that have been in Ávila and an important part of Ávila for more than 100 years. The Jewish families include people like the Tamaños, the Amarillos, and then among their Muslim populations, people such as the Ali Caro, the family of Ali Caro, which is a very important dominant family in Ávila, de la Calle and Muchacho. But of course, and I am cutting things here, while the cost of paying for a beast of burden or for an axe or a shovel or something like that is one moment. Paying for peones, you have to pay for them the salary for almost a year while they go to Alhama and they stay there and work and so on. And we know what the payment is for people who go and serve in the Granada frontier, which amounts to around 2,000 maravedíes a year in salary for being on the frontier. So you could see how this was a continuous drain on the resources of both. Okay, I'm going to bring this to I have deleted many other examples of fiscal violence on Ávila's Aljamas in the late 1480s. It did not help that new pressure for contributions came together with a one-year moratorium on the payment of Christian debts to Jews and Muslims in 1488, and with their relocation to specific neighborhoods within the city wall. In fact, the excessive and continuous fiscal demands were slowly suffocating the Aljamas. For the Jews, the end came on 31st March 1492. Although the Catholic Monarchs issued letters protecting Jews and their property in the days between the edict and the actual expulsion, many Ávila's Jews engaged in a feverish transfer of their property and leases to converso relatives or friends. Others converted. A few years after 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand donated the land where the Jewish cemetery had once been located to a monastery. The tombs were plowed under and desecrated. The tombstones are scratched with crosses in a last attempt to erase the Jewish presence. For the Muslims, worse fate awaited. Unable to leave, only the very well-to-do was able to do so. They had to undergo a forced conversion in the early years of the 16th century. Royal neglect, and then a recrudescence of surveillance and punishments in the 1560s and 1570s before the final expulsion in the early 17th century. Yet these documents that I found in the library at UCLA during the COVID world, these documents that tell these multiple stories have survived despite physical and fiscal violence against religious minorities in Ávila and elsewhere. These accounts are testimonials to the enduring presence of Jews and Muslims in a Castilian city long ago, and of royal oppression and fiscal violence to which they were unwilling victims. Thank you.